Well, hey everybody, happy Friday. Good morning and grace and peace to you. Welcome to Find the Intersection. My name is Paul Dezay. It's good to be with you. Today we are going to be talking about the threads, the themes, the intersections that run through the lectionary passages for this coming Sunday, which is the first kind of like real Sunday of ordinary time. Last week was Trinity Sunday, and ordinary time is also called kingdom time. And so it talks about how we participate in God's kingdom. And that's this season pretty much is the second half of the year, which takes us all the way to Advent, right? Christ the King Sunday is the last Sunday before Advent. So that's kind of where we're headed from a Christian year standpoint. So let's talk intersections. These are the passages that we have been looking at this week. We see Mark 3:20-35. We read that on Monday. And that passage is about Jesus's family as well as religious leaders think he's nuts, right? He's doing a lot of healing. He's healing on the Sabbath. He's setting people free from demons. There's a lot of stuff going on, and people think he's crazy. The religious leaders think he's in leagues with the devil. And Jesus is like, well, that doesn't make any sense. How could I be casting out demons and doing those things if I was in league with the devil? And then Jesus redefines family by pointing to the people that are around him and say, this is my family. It's an amazing passage. Tuesday, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, all the way into chapter 5, the first verse. Paul's going through a hard time, and his credibility is often challenged. And so here is in a situation where he's trying to encourage the others in this church in Corinth to endure in the midst of suffering and hardship. And so he talks about the temporal nature of what we're going through versus the eternal. And it's really written to encourage what God is doing and will do as we go through difficult days. Genesis 3 was Wednesday's passage, our Old Testament passage, which is the Garden of Eden scene where Adam and Eve are hiding from God. And there is the whole interaction of blame game. What have you done? And Adam says it's her fault, and she says it's the serpent's fault. So it's the beginning of the unraveling, right? But God is persistently involved in their lives. It's such a beautiful story of God's willingness to love people who have been disobedient. And anyway, there's a lot that we could talk about that. But the alienation that begins to occur because of that sin in the relationship with God and the relationship one to another, we see that in the garden scene. And then yesterday's Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry out of chaos I cry out to you, Lord. Please rescue me, please forgive me. Your forgiveness leads me to worship you. And then at the end, it is this call to the congregation of Israel to say, let's put our hope in the Lord. Let's put our hope. Let's wait for what God's going to do because of his love. He's been faithful in the past. He'll be faithful in the future. Now, there's a lot here. And so I just jotted down a few things. I think this week's primary intersection is a testing of our allegiance. Where do we put our faith? And as we begin kingdom time, do we pledge allegiance to Jesus and his kingdom? Or are we more focused on our own things? And we see this throughout these passages. Even the family and the religious leaders are looking at things from their own perspective instead of the heavenly perspective. And so this pledging allegiance to Jesus is participating in his kingdom work, right? And we see this struggle in all the passages, especially in Genesis, as we see Adam and Eve trusting in their own kingdom, becoming like God, desiring to elevate themselves at the expense of not participating in what God is and will do in the future. And so that's a heavy choice. And that's a choice we all have, right? Sin is kind of building our own kingdom. Sin is not trusting in what God's kingdom. God reigns. He is king over all. He's the Lord over all, and allegiance is trusting in the King, right? And that idea of faith is this idea of allegiance, and could go into that quite a bit. Another element that we see in this scriptures is the idea of suffering and evil and sin. All of this is working against what God is up to, what God is doing. We see evil in the gospel passage, and Jesus says he is binding up the strong man, right? He is defeating evil and ultimately defeats evil on the cross. But there's this nature of things that are working against this idea of suffering. And yes, God could take suffering and turn something good into it, but suffering isn't his design. Evil isn't his design. Persecution isn't his design. It is a byproduct of the disintegration, the deformation of society, moving away from God's kingdom agenda. So we have suffering and evil and things like that. But finally, I jotted down in my notes for this week's intersection, but God is faithful. God is faithful. If you take a look at the Adam and Eve story and what happens afterwards, God's heart is broken in the whole Noah situation with the evil that the people have done. His heart breaks. He is emotionally involved and chooses to participate in ways to bring about restoration. His steadfast love that we see in the Psalm means God's faithful love. God is faithful. He calls Abraham and Sarah to be part of the solution. He, throughout the Old Testament, is working and is faithful, his covenant faithfulness. Even when we sin, even when we move the other direction, God is faithful and moves towards us. So those are the intersections. It's really a testing of allegiance, this idea of suffering and persecution and evil that's moving against what God is up to in the world, and we can choose to participate. But regardless of our choice, God is faithful. And may that be an encouragement to you. Even when we're not faithful, God is faithful to us. So those are the intersections. I'd be very curious to what you came up with. Again, there's no right answers here. There's a lot of ways these scriptures kind of parallel, and sometimes they're completely different, but there's overlaps, and that's what we're looking for. We're trying to see how God is moving throughout the story of Scripture, not just in an isolated passage, but throughout all of the Bible. As John Wesley said, the whole tenor of Scripture. All right, so that's all I got. I hope you have an amazing Friday, and Sandy Hook peeps, I will see you on Sunday, Lord willing, grace and peace